Welcome back to the Big Dream Comics podcast. If you're new, thanks for checking us out. If you're returning, we appreciate your support. I'm your host, and with me is Snypehunter, lead writer and artist for Big Dream Comics.
Welcome, everybody.
Today we're discussing some of our favorite stories: Iron Man, The Armor Wars 1 and 2. I will give a summary of the first Iron Man Armor Wars, then Snypehunter will add his thoughts, then I'll give a summary of the second Armor Wars, and then Snypehunter will give his thoughts and compare the two. The first Armor Wars occurred in the Iron Man series from the 80s, issues number 225 to 232. They were written by David Michelini and Bob Layton, with art from Mark Bright, Layton, and Barry Windsor Smith. The comics were actually titled Stark Wars, and only given the Armor Wars title later, from a line by Jim Rhodes in the comic. The Armor Wars begin after Tony Stark analyzed some armor from an ex-villain named Force. He found that some of his tech was in the armor, so he asked Force where he got it, and he said it was sold to him by Justin Hammer, a rival industrialist of Tony Stark's. He also learned that it had been stolen by a villain called the Spy Master and then sold to Justin Hammer. Tony recruited Ant-Man Scott Lang to help him steal the client list from one of Justin Hammer's offices. Tony developed a negator pack that would render any mechanism using his technology useless. The first villain he went after was Stiltman, whom he easily defeated and attached the negator pack to. The second villain, the Mauler, gave up the armor without a fight. The third villain, the Controller, put up a good fight because he was using mind-controlled Citizen, but Iron Man was able to defeat him. Then it was on to 3 armored villains called Raiders, whom Iron Man was able to defeat, but he didn't know that they were sent by a rival called Edwin Cord, who's out for revenge against Tony Stark. Up next was Stingray, who's actually a government agent. Iron Man confronted him, but Stingray would not allow him to analyze his technology. So a battle ensued, and eventually Iron Man was able to put a negator pack on Stingray, but found that there was no Stark tech. Since Stingray was not a villain, this was a lot of bad publicity for Stark Enterprises, so Tony Stark was forced to publicly, quote unquote, fire his bodyguard Iron Man. Iron Man was then able to battle the Beetle and disable his technology. Then he was able to trick S.H.I.E.L.D. into sending their battle-armored Manjoids after Iron Man, and he was able to neutralize all of them. His most difficult mission to this point was to disable all the guardsman armor that he had designed to guard the Vault, which was a supervillain prison underground in Colorado. He needed help from Jim Rhodes to disable some of the armor, while Iron Man took care of the others. During this battle, he also had to confront the Captain, who was Steve Rogers after he had been replaced as Captain America. 2 suits of armor were located in the USSR, called the Crimson Dynamo and the Titanium Man, which required Tony to fly over there in his stealth armor. And then he accidentally killed the Titanium Man, apparently. In order to avoid an international incident, Tony was officially kicked off of the Avengers. The last suit of armor using his technology was called Firepower, which was developed by Edwin Cord. Iron Man confronted Firepower and was beaten badly, so Tony Stark and Jim Rhodes had to fake Iron Man's death using an empty suit. Edwin Cord refused to give up the Firepower suit to the United States government, which had funded his research, and used the Firepower suit to attack Stark Enterprises based on his own vendetta. This forced Tony Stark to build a new and improved Iron Man suit, but he planned to destroy it after defeating Firepower and retiring as Iron Man. Iron Man was able to convincingly beat Firepower in the rematch and destroy the suit. A computer virus developed by one of Tony's employees ensured that this particular technology would never be used by anyone else again. In the epilogue, drawn by Barry Windsor Smith, Tony has a nightmare about the anger caused by his technology being stolen and him actually going after enemies instead of reacting to them. So, after the nightmare, he had to make peace with his beast inside and the guilt from him thinking that he killed the Titanium Man. Snypehunter, what were your thoughts on the Armor Wars?
Well, I really liked the Armor Wars. It had a classic 80s feel. You could tell by the clothes and the hair. And just like the movies of the 80s, it had lots of action. There were really great armor designs. Besides the three Iron Man armors, all of his armored enemies had their classic designs. The Armor Wars had a epic feel to it, and it was a great opportunity for Iron Man to transition from an 80s kind of more boxy armor to a more streamlined 90s type of armor that is more recognizable to people who have seen the movies. There were also a lot of 80s references with characters drawn as Don Johnson and Michael J. Fox, and there was a hilarious joke in retrospect where one of the employees recommends that they call Cosby to be the next Iron Man after they think Iron Man has died.
The second Armor Wars occurred in the Iron Man issues in the 90s of 258 to 266. They were written by John Byrne with art by John Romita Jr. These issues actually had Armor Wars 2 printed on the covers at the top. The second Armor Wars begins when we are introduced to a mysterious Mr. DeWitt who wants to use Tony Stark as his pawn in some kind of revenge scheme. There's an attack at a nuclear research facility, and Tony Stark, as Iron Man, investigates. What he finds is what looks like the ghost of the Titanium Man, who he supposedly killed in the first Armor Wars. After the attack and making sure that the nuclear research facility was safe, Tony has a 3-day blackout. Tony returns to the nuclear research facility as Iron Man and finds the Titanium Man ghost again. He admits to them that he is the same Iron Man that killed him. Then the Titanium Man ghost reveals that he is actually the living laser. The living laser was jealous when he heard that firepower had killed Iron Man. So he wanted to see if this was the same Iron Man as before, so he could have the honor of killing him. During the battle, we find out that brother and sister Mars twins of Mars Corporation are funding the mysterious Mr. DeWitt, and they order him to prove that he can control Tony Stark's body and ordered them to shut it off, thereby paralyzing Tony in the Iron Man suit. The living laser watches Iron Man just fall down and become unresponsive, but doesn't want to finish him off because he doesn't want an easy victory. Tony manages to mentally control another empty suit of armor to recover his paralyzed body. Later on, after being checked out by medical professionals and them not finding anything, Mr. DeWitt takes control of Tony's body. Jim Rhodes manages to subdue Tony and help him into a suit of armor, which prevents DeWitt from being able to control his movements. Although Tony is paralyzed, he is able to control a suit of Iron Man armor, but his response time is dramatically lower than if he was in full control of his body. So he recruits Wonder Man and Dr. Pym to help Iron Man return to the nuclear research facility and defeat the living laser. After defeating the laser, Tony investigates how someone could possibly take control of his body. He realizes that when he had a microchip implanted in him to help him walk after his legs had been paralyzed after getting shot, that he didn't research the companies that made the microchip enough. So he investigated more and found a subsidiary of Mars Corp. Jim Rhodes commented that a Mars Corp helicopter had been monitoring them. So Tony decides to investigate Mars Corp. As Iron Man, he busts into DeWitt's secret laboratory and finds the scientists and technology that was trying to control him, so he destroys it. Then he encounters DeWitt in a war suit that is faster and stronger than Tony can handle in his reduced state. Luckily, Jim Rhodes flies in another Iron Man suit, and between the two of them, they are able to destroy DeWitt's armor, and then a building falls on him and apparently kills Mr. DeWitt. Now, also throughout the whole story, there's a subplot about a villain called the Mandarin who recovers one of his 10 rings and some of his memories, which enables him to go to China and awaken a space dragon called Fin Fang Foom. With his power over the dragon, he attacks the Chinese military and demands that they hand him over control of all of China. Snypehunter, what are your thoughts on Armor Wars 2?
Well, First of all, I always love John Romita Jr.'s art. I'm a huge fan. He's drawn the Punisher, Spider Man, Wolverine, and his style just works great with Iron Man. It gives it a weightiness and an epic feel to the story. I have to say, though, that there really wasn't much armor action until the very end. And then, well, I like the Mandarin, and he's one of Iron Man's arch villains. His story takes up a lot of panels and makes the main plot less epic. Now, at the end of the Armor Wars, DeWitt uses his technology to paralyze Iron Man while he's fighting him, so he must be able to conclude that Tony Stark is in the Iron Man suit, but it's not really gone over in the story. And then when Tony Stark unmasks DeWitt in his war suit, he has no idea who he is. So, unless it's explained in other issues that I haven't read, I really have no idea what Mr. DeWitt's vendetta against Tony Stark was about, other than just being hired by the Mars twins who compete with Tony Stark in the business world.
How would you compare Armor Wars 1 and 2?
While I love John Romita Jr.'s art, I have to say that Armor Wars 2 does not hold a candle to the first Armor Wars. The first Armor Wars featured three different Iron Man suits and many different designs for the villains and opponents. With the subplot, the Armor Wars 2 story probably could have been told in half the issues that was actually published in. The story of some of Tony Stark's rivals trying to take control of his body just doesn't seem important enough to warrant the Armor Wars 2 title. Maybe if another armored foe was responsible for the ghost of the Titanium Man and that led to a big battle, the story may have been worthy of the Armor Wars title. I would have liked to have seen the suit of armor that Tony mentally controlled maybe have a different design, but I could see why it was important that they look the same so that opponents couldn't tell them apart. But at the end, maybe Jim Rhodes could have shown up in like a War Machine armor similar to the battle that we saw against Whiplash in the Iron Man 2 movie. Then the way the two Iron Man suits pretty much just use their combined power to defeat DeWitt's war suit doesn't compare to the original Armor Wars where Iron Man gets defeated by firepower, has to endure the disappointment, and then develop a new suit, and then get the upper hand in the rematch. In the original Armor Wars, Iron Man and Captain America don't really fight each other. It's more of a confrontation that hurts their friendship, but we don't actually get a fight like we see in the movie Captain America Civil War. Again, I really enjoyed the Armored Wars 2 story and love the art, but I feel like if they're going to title something Armor Wars 2, there should be more armored villains. Um, Basically, the living laser discovers that he's still the same Iron Man, and I feel like a bigger story could have involved somebody maybe blackmailing Iron Man or Tony Stark, and then DeWitt story just kind of fizzled, and I feel like maybe he could have used his battle to discover that Tony Stark is Iron Man, and then the Mars twins. I don't know if there was a subsequent confrontation where Tony deals with them for trying to take control of his body, and half the story kind of feels like it's leading up to a big confrontation between Iron Man and the Mandarin and Fin Fang Foom as part of the Armor Wars, but then you get to the end and you realize that half the story was setting up another story that's after Armor Wars 2.
I really enjoyed both stories, and like you, I wish Armor Wars 2 had a little more war between armors, but overall, it's a really fun story, and that's all we have for today. Thanks to Snypehunter, and thank you for listening. See you next time.